Well, thank you. You know, I had such a long commute to come over here, so glad to see so many smiling faces. But I want to thank you guys for coming out today. Thank you for coming to Tredegar here and keeping us going. But my name is Candace Hart. I'm a park ranger with Richmond National Battlefield. Spent 12 years at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered, and then transferred over here about 3 years ago. Just trying to continue learning more about the Civil War and trying other different sites to get out there and interpret what we preserve. But I started getting into, you know, for years, you think about the Civil War, and we always put the number out there, the 620,000 Americans plus. New studies say it may be up to 700,000 Americans. And it's always been kind of a number. You never really think about each one of those people. Each one of those numbers is someone's husband, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's uncle or cousin. And so I really started thinking about it. We were just chatting at the front desk one day, and it really just kind of hit home that these are real people. And so I started learning a little bit more, and I really have gotten very interested in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. That 1866 time period, which we are in the sesquicentennial of, but that 1866 time period of when these soldiers are going home, when they're heading back to their homes after the surrender at Appomattox, after Johnston's surrender in North Carolina, they're heading back to their families. What are they going through? Today we have names for it, PTSD. Our soldiers come home with it all the time. But back then, they didn't really have a name for it. They didn't really understand it. We still don't understand it today. And so that's kind of what's gotten me interested in it, especially because I've been researching my own family. Directly on my mother's side, we had three, my great-great-grandfather plus his two brothers, all of them enlist in the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, and they go off to fight. Well, Jethro, the eldest boy, he enlisted in 1861, and he will die by 1862, which you will see over there. He is deceased. So Jethro enlists, he puts the saddle on his horse, rides off to war, dies of sickness. He is one of those 620,000 men who never make it home. And so it got me thinking, what are his brothers thinking? How are they feeling at home? What is the family going through? Particularly because I still have yet to find his grave. And so it really it hit home, and I really started looking into it, what these people are going through after the war. Because history books tend to go right after Appomattox, boom, we're in Reconstruction. We don't get into these are real people, and they go through real struggles. And so Jethro just kind of really made it hit home for me that this is someone we may never find his grave. I may be lucky and find it one day, but he may be one of those unknowns that never gets to return back home. Quite literally, after the Civil War, after it ends, a daily South Carolinian newspaper will put this in their paper. We are literally a land of mourning. This is the mentality of the 1866 time period. Directly following, there is lots of mourning. 1/4 of Southern white men between ages 20 to 40 are dead. That is 18% of the population. In North, 6% of the white men are dead. And again, this is not just a number. These are people's family members that are never coming back home. So we are literally a land in mourning. There's another account that says, there is not a household exempt from the universal lamentation which ascends from a grief-stricken people. This country is in mourning. Women are wearing black. It is a very sad time period. It is definitely a very tough time period for women because it is not until the Korean War that the USA established a policy of identifying and repatriating soldiers' bodies. So you have a lot of soldiers who are left out on the battlefield. With this, it is not until World War I that soldiers started wearing identifying tags. As we all know, these soldiers are going into the battle. They do not have identification on unless they themselves have stitched it onto their uniforms, whether they're wearing a coin with their name engraved. They have nothing to show who they are. And so they're going off into these battles, and they're getting shot, and they're being killed. And unless their buddy is nearby to identify them, a lot of times they can't be. And especially in the fast-moving campaigns of the 7 days here around Richmond, the Union Army is being pushed off. The Confederates are chasing them. They are moving boom, boom, boom. Literally every day they're on the move and they're battling. they're leaving the dead behind. And so the locals, it is up to them to bury them, and they don't know who they are. So if you ever go out to the national cemeteries, you will see unknown, unknown, 6 unknown soldiers, 5 unknown soldiers. We don't know who they are. So quite literally, as the war is ending, and actually after a lot of battles, the women will flood to the battlefields because they are left with a void of uncertainty. They don't know what has happened to their loved one. They know that they're there. They know that they're in the battle, but they don't know what's happened to them. They haven't heard from them. So a lot of women are going to flood to these battlefields trying to search for their loved one. One woman insisted that her husband's body be dug up before she would believe that it was actually him. His buddies had buried him. She gets there. She doesn't believe it. She forces him to dig him up. Diaries and letters repeatedly mention that they're unable to realize the death. They cannot realize it. They can't come to terms with it. Survivors have said they cannot see clearly what has been lost. They're in this mourning period. They just cannot grip it. Denial and numbness becomes very prevalent among both sides of the war. A lot of women just unable to realize what has happened. One woman said, "I think sometimes he is not dead. It might have been a mistake." So a very sad time period with these women who are flooding to the battlefields trying to find their loved ones. One woman, she actually passed away after she was told that her husband had been killed. She simply could not handle it. The grief killed her. In South Carolina, the parents of 18-year-old Oliver Middleton, he died in 1864, were never the same, and a year later his mother will pass away, an early death. So very tough time period for families, women and children trying to struggle with the new reality that is being forced on them, that their loved ones are gone, that they're never going to come back, and in a lot of cases, they will never know what happened to them, simply because they're unknowns. A grief-stricken people. The reality in which that they are living in is a South, especially in the South, trapped in poverty. Most of the Civil War is fought down here in the South, with your few times that they do jut up into the North, Gettysburg and Antietam and all of that. So the South is trapped in poverty. Much of the population close to starvation point in a lot of areas. 2/3 of the assessed value of Southern wealth is destroyed. 2/5 of Southern livestock is destroyed. More than 1/2 of Southern machinery is ruined. Extensive damage to railroads. That's actually them ripping up a railroad outside of Atlanta, the Union Army ripping it up. So their railroads are destroyed, which makes it very hard to get relief to these country areas to get them some food. And it says South's total wealth from all sources had dropped by about 60%. So not only do you have the grief of the war itself and the soldiers losing their lives, this is the reality that a lot of these people are now suffering through. You have these women, you have these children, and then you have the men returning home to poverty. So it's a very tough time period in which you are mourning, but you are also struggling to survive in the lieu of the Civil War. Sharecropping grew up out of necessity. A lot of planters could not pay wages, so instead they leased the land out to farm laborers trying to make ends meet. Some states had to sell their natural resources in order to make ends meet. They sold them very cheaply to buyers, which ended up strip mining and erosion and things like that. Horse breeding tanked in some areas. One horse farm owner said, "I have become careless in almost everything that requires exertion. I feel little interest in any form of business." He will die prematurely in 1867. He was a horse farm owner. Literally, his horses had been taken for the cavalry, and he just could not handle it. He could not come out of that hole, and he ends up dying. Because of this, a lot of women, thousands of women, will have to enter into the workplace just to try and make the ends meet for their families. Mrs. Custer will write, "An army of black-clad and weary creatures who had lost their husbands or sons in the war and were working for themselves or for their children." So thousands of women entering the workforce just trying to make ends meet. At quitting time, they could be seen hurrying home to cook dinner for their children. Sometimes marriages are ruined. when the soldiers come back. 24-year-old Charlotte Cross will say that her husband the war had rendered him unfit for work, for society, and too soon unworthy of a wife's care, forgiveness, or endurance. Marriages ended up getting ruined. Some of the soldiers, we have found accounts of the soldiers later on become very violent and start abusing their wives, which ends up breaking up the marriage. So lots of just struggles trying to make ends meet in this post-war period. So not only do we have all of the death, men not coming home, but now we have to struggle to survive all of that on top of one another. Because of this, you do see an increase in broken in body and mind, insanity. After the Civil War, the numbers in insane asylums will increase. There's a lot of drug abuse. There's opium for pain relievers, morphine, things like that. But by 1879, it was estimated by an Army surgeon that 45,000 Union vets had reached addiction levels. So there is alcoholism as well. We have some accounts as well about how after coming out of prisons, after coming out of the war, a lot of the soldiers had resorted to alcohol, and they were basically becoming alcoholics. So a lot of struggle to mentally cope with this, turning to the bottle, turning to opium, especially if you have been injured or have any kind of an amputation, need that for your phantom pain. Violent crime does increase as well. You have border areas like Kansas and West Virginia, which were still fighting after the war. We all know the Hatfields and McCoys, but they're still fighting it out. So a lot of struggle, which ends up breaking some men. Some men just could not handle it. They fought for 4 years in the war. They have done their duty. They have done their service. They have literally seen their buddies die in their arms, and now they come home to all of this. They come home to the poverty. They come home to the wrecked home. Some of them don't even know what they're coming home to. They leave Appomattox and they don't know what's in their future. For the North, it is a little bit better because since the war is mainly down here in the South, lots of homes turn into battlefields. Like Gaines's Mill, that was the property of Mrs. Sarah Watt, 77 years old. She will never return to that home. It was literally, her yard was a graveyard, and her house was covered in blood and bullet holes. So she never comes back home. So for a soldier, you don't know what you're coming home to. And then when you get there, you see what it is, the reality of the situation. And it breaks a lot of the soldiers. It was just too much for some of them. Now, I did think this was very interesting. But admissions to insane asylums rose in July and August of 1862 when the first Confederate draft was enforced. They stayed for about 3 months and then they were released. So we were basically seeing the first draft dodgers fleeing to the insane asylums so that they wouldn't be drafted, and then once the draft was over, they're like, okay, I'm good now, and they were sent home. So I thought that was very interesting, those draft dodgers. But after the war, it does become a reality. These soldiers are sent to insane asylums simply because they cannot handle it. Families do try and take care of them as much as possible. But a lot of times the families, quite literally, if they could not support themselves, they would move to homes with other people. So you have multiple families living together just trying to make ends meet. And sometimes they just couldn't handle it. With everything else, they could not take care of their husband or their son, and so they turned to the state for help. Eastern State is down in Williamsburg, Western State, Government Hospital for the Insane, they're all over the place trying to help these soldiers. By the start of the war, there were 8,500 patients in mental homes. By the end of the war, there were 17,000, so the number had doubled. By 1870, it doubles again. There's also a rise in mental illness and post-emancipation African Americans as well. Again, struggling with trying to make do in this new world that they find themselves in. Some of these soldiers, I have some accounts if you don't mind hearing about them, but some of these guys is very interesting, and I don't even know how they made it as far as they did. But one soldier, he never got over his imprisonment at Andersonville Prison and worked obsessively on building a model prison in his backyard. He was later committed to a hospital for the insane. He was building his own Andersonville at home. He just could not leave it. Wallace Woodford flailed in his sleep, dreaming that he was still searching for food at Andersonville. He died at age 22. His headstone reads, 8 months a sufferer in prison, came home to die. William Hancock had gone off to war, a strong young man, his sister said, but returned so broken in body and mind that he didn't know his own name. Edward Newcomb, he attempted suicide on the condition of his affairs, in that he has no property. He ended up getting put into a home for a little while. So he tried to commit suicide because he broke. He came home to nothing. William Dix tried unsuccessfully to kill himself. His attempt was apparently developed by property. Of 455 patients admitted between 1861 to 1865, 57 of them entered because of psychological problems attributed to the war, is what the doctors put it down. John Hilt from Michigan lost an arm in the 7 Days battles. So right out here, he had to be transferred to the government hospital for the insane in Washington, D.C. for acute mania. He died in 1911. I believe he was the one who actually lost it at Seven Pines, I believe, is where he lost his arm. But he just couldn't handle it. Christopher Columbus Hedrick was too close to an exploding shell at Malvern Hill. 35 years later, he still had problems with a disease of the head. And they said it rises periodically, giving much pain and discharge of matter through the nose, as well as forcing him into insane behavior. 35 years later, he is still suffering with what he had endured at Malvern Hill. William Miller, a member of the company of Hampton-Sydney Boys. I went to Longwood University, so I had to put Hampton-Sydney in there. The Hampton-Sydney Boys, lately scattered by McClellan, he was sent to Western States, out in Stanton. Disoriented and confused, his chart indicated he tears his clothes and is uncontrollable. Lots of accounts that I've found say they tear their clothes. They're ripping their clothes apart and shredding things. John Curlin's first assignment, this one's really sad. His first assignment in the war, he enlists and he joins in the war. His first assignment was to shoot some deserters, which frightened him out of his senses. After they shot the deserters, he jumped into a river and tried to drown himself. So they sent him to an asylum. Private Kristen Fisher of the 45th Wisconsin Volunteers returned home in a state of confusion and incapable of speaking after suffering a shell wound to the head. He's wandered around as a pauper until he's picked up by the local authorities, and he was sent to the Northern Hospital for the Insane. Joseph Knoll served in the Virginia Cavalry until 1864, when he became insane and violent. Doctor recorded he can give no account of himself, cannot even answer yes or no to questions. He tore his clothes. They actually found in that one, they think that he went insane because he was fighting against his brother. His brother was on the other side. And then family members also went insane. Caleb Rector had 4 sons in the Confederate Army, and for a year he spent in a deranged episode, they said. Catherine Bailey, she showed her first indication of insanity at the time her son was ordered into the Army. She developed severe depression and attempted violence to herself on several occasions. These are the things you don't hear about in the history books. How these men are suffering. Quite literally, your first assignment in the Civil War is to shoot some people who were just too scared to go into battle. I mean, I would have been the first deserter, I'll tell you that right now. I couldn't have made it. And his first assignment is to shoot these deserters. And it broke him. So lots of suffering. Very hard time for these soldiers. And some of them, like the young fellow who lost his arm in the 7 days, he will die in the prison, in the asylum. He will actually die in 1911. He spends the rest of his life there. There was a commander in a Connecticut regiment who he goes off, fights. They spent time at Andersonville. They broke and run at Antietam. Very colorful history of this regiment. But after the war, he ends up going to college, and everything is looking fine. And then all of a sudden, he turns violent, and he starts hurting his wife to the point that his comrades will put him in an asylum. It's just post-traumatic stress. I mean, it hits these guys after the war. But during the time period, they don't really have a term for it. They don't really understand it. Sometimes they call it melancholia. And if you start showing these symptoms, a lot of times they will put you on the front line to try and scare it out of you or possibly get you shot. It's a very rough time. So not only that, a lot of these men are coming home with PTSD and things, but they're also coming home disabled. I found in one account that it's actually a lot better in the Civil War to wound a guy than it is to kill them, because a wounded guy takes more resources because you have to take care of him. So a lot of times, most soldiers, when they're shot in the Civil War, most of the wounds are in the arms and the legs. So it does take more resources to take care of them. They have to send them to a hospital. You have to feed them. You have to, do whatever you can to take care of them. So a lot of times they would shoot to wound, just so that you can try and drain the other side's resources, I've read somewhere. But war injuries, very common, we all know, and I hope you don't mind, some of these pictures do get a little graphic. Well, they're not too graphic, but, I show them to kids, so I guess we'll be all right. But anyway, the soldiers, they do suffer. The disabled ones now have to go back home, and for the Southerners, they don't know where they're going back home to. This is a fellow from Georgia who was shot at Fort Stedman, I believe, at Petersburg, and it goes through both of his legs. The round literally goes through his right leg into the left leg. They have to amputate both of them. And he's going back home. He doesn't even know what he's going home to, and now he's disabled. And it's very hard to be a disabled person back then because they don't have some of the things that we have today. Makes it very hard. If you're a farmer, how do you work like this? So it makes it very difficult. Not only are you returning home to possible poverty and the loss of your home, but you're returning home completely disabled. Now, in the beginning, a lot of them were very proud of this because a lot of them are like, well, at least I lived. I made it through, and this is a small price to pay for what my cause, for what I'm fighting for. But as the years go on and as the burdens really start hitting them, they start to turn, some of them do turn very bitter. Some of them do not, but some of them do. They start to turn bitter because they're unable to do simple tasks that they could do before. They have phantom pain. We all know about phantom pain. They do suffer from that. Sometimes they suffer discrimination at work. I've actually found accounts where some of them were sometimes hidden away by their families because they were too embarrassed to be seen around them in public. So sometimes they're hidden away. They're being discriminated against. Sometimes there were botched amputations, which made it even worse. I found an account of a soldier who had a flesh wound in his leg. His leg was amputated because the surgeon wanted experience. So he lost his leg for no reason. And this came from another surgeon who balked at this. He's like, wait a minute. This was a real surgeon seeing this new guy doing it, and he's like, we need to train these people because this soldier lost his leg for nothing. So literally, some of these amputations are completely botched because these surgeons coming into the beginning of the war, a lot of them don't know what they're doing. A lot of these are country doctors, and they start amputating, and they do it wrong. Things like bones sticking out and stuff like that. Very, very rough, which makes it very hard for these men to then have to live with it. The federal government will try and provide jobs for the northern side. They will try and provide jobs for them, things like clerks, door greeters, things like that, but it's a very small amount. Considering there's, I believe it was about 50,000 amputees, I believe, is the number which they kind of estimate, about 50,000 amputees. It's a drop in the bucket. Very few jobs for these men. But they do try and give them prosthetics, as you see here. Rush actually gets some new legs. Not only in the federal authorities will purchase 4,095 prosthetic legs, 2,300 arms, 61 hands, and 14 feet. So that's in 1867. So the federal government is actually trying to provide, they're trying to provide prosthetics for these soldiers, but the South will do it as well. Not as the federal government does it as the federal government does, but in the South it's by state. So the South will actually try and provide for their soldiers, which is amazing considering what they are going through. They are going through a land that has just been torn up by all of the war, and now they're trying to put money toward their veterans, which is amazing. I love it. It's great. In 1866, Mississippi spent half of its $30,000 budget on artificial limbs. Half of its budget on artificial limbs. South Carolina, $20,000 in 1866. North Carolina 81,000 between 65 and 71. Virginia, 20,000 in 67. Arkansas, 10,000 in 67. Texas attempted 50,000, but it didn't pass. The state didn't actually pass it. Louisiana did not have a program, but the ladies of the state, Ladies Benevolent Association bought them prosthetics. So the ladies actually stepped up to try and buy them prosthetics. This amazes me. Like I said, here they are struggling through poverty and all of this, trying to rebuild, and they're buying prosthetics for their soldiers. So that was very touching. I loved that. The problem with prosthetics back then is they are very uncomfortable and they're painful. Again, those soldiers who have the bone jutting out can't wear a prosthetic. It hurts them. So a lot of times the soldiers will ditch them. They will get them, but they won't be able to use them just because it hurts so much. So prosthetics, they do try and help them, but it is actually a struggle for the soldiers. This fellow right here, Burt Stiles, very interesting. After the Civil War, they notice, the people of the country notice that a lot of these men are struggling because they are missing limbs and things. Burt Stiles, as you can see, has his prosthetic on. I thought this was so cool. But he will completely lose his arm, and he gets a prosthetic and learns to play on it, which I think is just fascinating how he's able to do that. But after the Civil War, they realized the struggles these men are going through, but these guys, they're trying to learn how to make do with their new life. How can I play the violin? Is that a violin or a fiddle? Trying to play, I don't know musical instruments. I push the play button on my iPod. That's what I do. But he's trying to learn to make do. He's trying to go back to a normal life and play his instrument. Well, also after the Civil War, this guy will enter into the left-handed penmanship contest. There was a contest for left-handed penmanship specifically for veterans because they are trying to learn how to write with their new, they've lost their right arm. They're trying to learn how to write. And so they do this little, basically a competition, and there's several of them they would do as a way to let them win some money. And this is Burt's penmanship right there, his left-handed penmanship. So Burt Stiles, that is his penmanship. I couldn't do that ever. I mean, look, that's his left hand. That's awesome. But they do have these little, competitions as a way to try and let them try and learn how to write better, but also win some money off of it, which was really neat. So all of this was part of the same exhibition at the Library of Congress. These pictures of him with his prosthetic and then his actual writing there. So very interesting. Again, the country trying to help them, to give them prosthetics, trying to help give them a better life. Also after the Civil War, this is the rough one. Also after the Civil War, you see the medical department trying to do what they can to help. This is Roland Ward. I talk about him a lot. And as long as teachers allow, I will show this to children. But he is a reconstructive surgery after the Civil War. He is hit in the face by a piece of shell, I believe at the Wilderness. The shell comes through, completely rips off his bottom jaw and just takes it all. And so this is him afterwards. As you can see, it's hanging there. How do you go home like that? How do you eat like that? So the federal government will actually, the military medical, they will actually try, the doctors will try and save him. They will try and give him a mouth back. And he will go through several surgeries, as you can see, as they pull that all together to give him a mouth. He will grow a beard later in life, so you can barely tell if there's anything wrong. They say that he can speak and then he can eat later on in life. So reconstructive surgery, seeing its birth in the Civil War, because this is how the men are being left. This is how they're leaving the Civil War, and they're trying to give them a better life, trying to help them cope with what is happening. So I found he's very interesting. He's a very well documented case of Roland Ward as he goes through his surgeries after the war. So again, reconstructive surgery, seeing its birth, trying to help these men after the war. Also after the Civil War, you have tons of bodies just being left. So they're trying to help the living, but now we also have to help the dead. As we all know, after the Civil War, there will be volunteers that will come from the north, and they will flood down here into the south trying to find these men, men that are buried at like Gaines's Mill and at Malvern Hill. For a Southerner, to die on Southern soil was kind of an honor. So sometimes they would actually carry them back to their home state, but a lot of times they were left there because they were dying on Southern soil and it was an honor. They were dying on the land that they were fighting for. So there are still graves that are out there today. We know we haven't gotten them all, but there's still some of those boys that are out there. But for a Northerners, when they die here, are dying on enemy soil at the time period. And there's a huge fear of grave desecration, which actually does occur both at Gettysburg and down here. It's on both sides. There are grave desecrations. And this is a fear that people have. We need to get these boys and put them somewhere where they can be safe. Quite literally, around Fort Harrison, a visitor to Fort Harrison after the war was walking around and he noticed a farmer out there. And he said the entire area was strewn with grinning skulls. And according to the observer, the disturbed bones were carried away in carts and sold to one of the fertilizing mills in Richmond. When the observer questioned the owner, the farmer, the owner said that he didn't put them there no-how. That was his mentality. He didn't care. I didn't put these dead men here. So he's selling the bones to be ground up for fertilizer. So you can see there's this instant worry about all of these dead soldiers. And so there will be this huge movement after the Civil War where the Northern volunteers will flood down here to the Southern sites and they will start finding the graves. There are thousands of shallow depressions and scattered bones throughout all around the Richmond area. A visitor to Cold Harbor in 1869 said he saw skulls, ribs, legs, and arm bones scattered about in fearful array, while the bones of many a poor soldier lay partially exposed to the action of the rain. That's in 1869. That is 4 years after the war, and their bodies are still out there. So they're trying to find these men, and they're trying to put them into our national cemeteries. So national cemeteries really seeing their birth in the Civil War because they're trying to find homes for these men, trying to put them in a place where they can be safe. And they will actually, this is Glendale Cemetery, and they will actually have, sometimes they will have veterans live there on the site to help protect the site. So national cemeteries, there were 6 cemeteries created around Richmond, approximately 17,000 Civil War dead. The reburial program will conclude in 1870. They tried to find as many as they could. After that, they just gave up and went back home. They figured they'd gotten most of them. Around here in Richmond, overall, they located and reinterred the remains of 299,000 Union soldiers. That's Union. Only about 58% of those could be identified because some of them had hastily made little markers about who they were when they were buried. We do not know about Confederate soldiers. We do not have a statistic for them because a lot of them were not recovered. Sometimes they were buried very quickly in mass graves, and even they haven't even been found today. So there isn't a very good Southern account. We have this number for the Union because of the reburial program. But it's a way to help bring kind of closure to the families, in my personal opinion, to create the cemetery so that the widows can actually have somewhere to visit, so they can actually see it. They're trying to bring closure. They're trying to get these men who died on the battlefield and put them somewhere where they can be remembered, where they're going to be protected and remembered even to today. Like I said, that's Glendale. We can go out there right now and go and visit those boys that they haven't been forgotten on those battlefields. So national cemeteries, very important because we're trying to bring some closure, especially to the families, but also to help those dead to get them protected. After the Civil War also, you see very quickly veterans groups being created because there is a lot going on. There's a lot of soldiers are suffering, families are suffering, and they're trying to heal these wounds. In the South, all over the country, sermons are very important. Preachers are very important. Pastors trying to help, trying to bring to terms, why did this happen? Why me? Why did I lose my son? And so you see a lot of locals turning to churches and things to try and find those answers. Well, soldiers tended to turn toward their veteran groups as well because this is a way that they can meet up together with their old comrades and relive the old days. And it was a way to keep that camaraderie. This was a very interesting one because this is a prisoners group, veteran group. Andersonville, Libby, Belle Isle, Florence, these were all prisoners of war. And they formed together to create their own veteran group as a way to keep in touch, as a way to kind of keep that camaraderie even later into life. Ladies' associations will be created as well. And most of these, if you look up their charters and things, they are created to help the people. They are created, like one says, to preserve the relics or memories of the war between the states, to cherish the ties of friendship that exist among the men who have shared common dangers, common suffering and privations, to care for the disabled and extend a helping hand to the needy, to protect the widow and orphan, to make and preserve the record of services of every member. So they're trying to create these organizations to take care of themselves, to have that group that can work with each other and that they can support each other. That's from the United Confederate Veterans Group. That was from its constitution. One of the earliest one was the Cavalry Survivors Association. It was created in 1866. It's one of the earliest Confederate veteran organizations. You have the Grand Army of the Republic, which we all know that's the northern version. Again, veterans groups that still exist in forms today with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, all see their birth from these groups, trying to help these men, trying to give them a community where they have a common background. They understand each other. You also have Memorial Days. Memorial Day finds its birth in the Civil War. There's so much we can look back to the Civil War for what we have today. Memorial Day was originally called Decoration Day, and it was a memorial day to remember what had happened during the Civil War and remember those soldiers. There's actually Southern Memorial Days as well. States would have their own Memorial Days also, little Confederate Memorial Days. So again, just trying to remember, trying to cope, trying to heal. Reunions, I like the little flag with the Tar Heel there. Reunions where they could get back together. This is a parade where the North Carolinians are marching through very proudly, these veterans. You also see these reunion groups like at Gettysburg and things like that. You see these veterans groups coming together to place monuments. This is where we get all of our monuments on our battlefields because they're trying to come together. They're trying to heal the wounds that they all suffered. Coming together on the battlefield, placing a monument there for them was kind of like their closure. So very important, these veterans groups, trying to help these men come to terms with what has happened and to heal themselves. The country goes through Reconstruction, as we all know, which wasn't always the best. But we do heal. 150 years later, they healed in a lot of ways. These soldiers went back homes. They went back to their families. They kept on going. Jethro's two brothers went home. I don't know what it was like in our family now that Jethro is dead, but the rest of them continue on. They get married. They have children. I would not be here today. If his second oldest brother, Richard Hyde, hadn't made it out of that war, I wouldn't be here. But they do make it through. They go back home. They do the best they can. They suffer, but they try and make it, and they come together. And basically, without them, we wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have a job today. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of shed a little bit of light about what it was like for these soldiers that are going home, what it was like to suffer through the Civil War. These guys get forgotten. We see a picture of them and it's like, oh, that guy's lost an arm. But imagine going home without that arm. Imagine going home without a jaw and going home that way. I can't even imagine it. And these men, these brave men and women and children, they all make it through, and they will continue on to give us what we have today. So anyway, I want to thank you guys for visiting. Hope I haven't ruined your lunch too much. But if you have any questions at all about any of this, feel free and ask.